Star Wars will forever be intertwined with George Lucas. I mean, he is the maker after all. But there was another Lucas who helped make Star Wars into one of the greatest sagas ever told. Marcia Lucas was one of the editors on Star Wars: A New Hope, but her story is not often shared. So today, we are going to paint a more complete picture of who Marcia Lucas is and was. What fueled her passion as an editor? How does she shape the story of Star Wars? And what has she been up to since her last IMDb credit of Return of the Jedi? We'll answer all that and more on this episode of ForceCenter Presents The Jedi Beat. I'm your host, Jennifer Landa. Marcia Griffin was born on October 4th, 1945 in Modesto, California. Yep, that Modesto. Marcia only lived in Modesto for a couple years as a child. When she was 2, her parents got divorced. So May Griffin, Marcia's mother, packed up her 2 young daughters and moved to North Hollywood. May was a single working mother who lived paycheck to paycheck. Money was tight, but Marcia has said that she grew up in a loving and supportive family. Being a latchkey kid had one perk. After school, she'd come home, turn on the TV, and watch old movies like Errol Flynn's Swashbucklers and Busby Berkeley musicals. You see, during the late 50s and 60s, television stations would broadcast classic films. Watching old movies was transcendent for young Marcia. Even though she lived in North Hollywood, show business seemed a world away. She knew no one in the industry, but it was those weekday afternoons that made Marcia fall in love with the movies. After graduating high school, Marcia went to Los Angeles City College. She wanted to help her mother financially, so she got a job at a mortgage banking firm in downtown Los Angeles and took chemistry courses at night. She quickly realized that mortgage banking was not her thing. But her boyfriend was working for the Hollywood Museum that was about to open up, and he was swamped and in need of an assistant. People had been donating movie memorabilia like scripts, photographs, and films, so he told Marcia, "Hey, I'll see if my boss will hire you as a librarian to catalog all these donations." The only catch was that all librarians had to apply to the California State Employment Office. When Marcia got to the employment office, there was only one job on file. The description said, "Apprentice Film Librarian. No experience necessary. Light typing." The job paid only $50 a week, which was less than her banking job, but working in a film library was much more exciting than the world of banking. She didn't have any experience, but since there was no experience necessary, she got the job. She was 18 years old. Being a film librarian wasn't glamorous Hollywood work, but she enjoyed it. Producers looking for specific footage would place an order at the library, and then Marcia would search for shots that fit what they were looking for. So for example, if a producer wanted a shot of a Studebaker driving down a residential street, Marcia would search through stock footage, and if it fit their needs, she ordered the negative prints. This process of combing through footage to tell a story is basically what a film editor does. Now, the Sandler Film Library also produced television commercials. So when the library was slow, Marcia would go over to the commercial division and learn all about post-production and how to edit TV commercials. With hard work and a little luck, Marcia eventually became an assistant editor for Sandler Film. Getting her union card was the first big step in Marcia's career as an editor. Being in the union meant good pay and better gigs. But when she left Sandler Film, she quickly learned that many editors didn't want women in the cutting room. There were all sorts of excuses. Girls couldn't lift the cans containing 10,000 feet of film, or that the editors talked like sailors and that type of foul language was too much for a delicate woman's ears. The job market was tough for women in the 1960s, and then she heard about a promising opportunity. Marcia had a friend who knew a lady in Van Nuys. This woman was an editor who liked to hire women, and that woman was Verna Fields. Meanwhile, in another area of Los Angeles, George Lucas was a recent graduate of USC's School of Cinema. It was the fall of 1966, and he was working as an assistant grip on a documentary for the United States Information Agency. Robert Dalva, George's friend from the USC Cinema Department, was working on a film about President Lyndon Johnson's trip to Asia. The editor of that film was Verna Fields, who was a veteran film editor and one of the few women in the male-dominated profession. When Verna Fields needed some extra help on the film, Robert recommended his old pal, George Lucas. Verna hired George in 1967, right when he was starting a graduate degree in film production at USC. George proved he was a capable editor, even if he did hate having other people telling him how to cut a film. You see, because this was a government film, there were strict rules editors had to abide by, like avoiding any shots of President Johnson's bald spot, and making sure all footage was consistent with American foreign policy. Verna was inundated with USIA footage, so she decided to hire an assistant editor to help with the load. That editor was Marcia Griffin. George and Marcia did not take to each other right away. They were pretty much stuck together in a small editing room in Verna Fields' house. Verna's house in the San Fernando Valley was a casual environment where other USC students would edit and log footage. But George told biographer Dale Pollock, quote, "Marcia had a lot of disdain for the rest of us because we were all film students. She was the only pro there," end quote. Indeed, she was basically hired to look over George's shoulder as he edited. Marcia knew more about editing than George did, but she was impressed by him. She told Dale Pollock, quote, "I had come out of this hectic commercial production world, and here was this relaxed guy who threaded the moviola very slowly and cautiously. He handled the film with such reverence," end quote. A moviola is a machine that was used for motion picture editing. Editors could study individual shots, which allowed them to determine more precisely where the best cut point might be. Editors would then cut and splice the film print together. The moviola would also bring George and Marcia together, but it would take months to splice that relationship. When George and Marcia finally began dating, their dates involved going to the movies, often taking in 2 movies in one day, one in the afternoon and one after dinner. Marcia and George shunned the Hollywood social scene and instead would spend their time happily griping about the film industry. George was a rebel filmmaker who wanted to buck the Hollywood studio system, while Marcia was determined to fight her way up the ladder to become a respected editor. The two may have come from different backgrounds, but they were cut from the same cloth. According to George, quote, "We were both feisty, and neither one of us would take any from the other. I sort of liked that. I didn't like someone who could be run over," end quote. One of the strongest bonds between Marcia and George was their love for film. Originally, George had wanted to move with Marcia to San Francisco and become an avant-garde filmmaker. This wasn't what Marcia had planned for her future, but she didn't mind San Francisco, and she was willing to take a leap of faith for their future together. But in 1967, George won a scholarship with Warner Brothers that would allow him to observe the studio's operation for 6 months. So he jumped at the chance, and the couple remained in Hollywood. Marcia continued climbing up the ladder and working for commercial production companies, while George did an apprenticeship with Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola became a mentor to George, and he eventually hired him to work on his small-budget film titled The Rain People. George helped out wherever the crew needed it, but he had a lot of downtime, so he decided to make a documentary about the toils of making a movie. The documentary, Filmmaker, is 30 minutes long and is still considered to be one of the best documentaries about the production of a film. The production of The Rain People and his documentary kept George in New York, which made the couple miss each other terribly. Marcia would eventually join him on location, and on a rainy February day in 1967, George proposed. Marcia said yes, and the two decided to get married as soon as The Rain People wrapped. Marcia and George edited Filmmaker together, and the result was a professional-looking documentary, even though George had been a one-man band with a shoestring budget. When Francis Ford Coppola began editing his film, The Rain People, editor Barry Malkin needed help organizing the footage. George recommended Marcia, and Coppola agreed to hire her. There was only one problem. Marcia had just been offered a job as an assistant editor on the film Medium Cool by Haskell Wexler. If she took it, she'd get her first credit on a feature film and would be a guaranteed 6 to 9 month job in Chicago. With Coppola's project, it'd only be 5 weeks of work in Nebraska. Of course, George was in Nebraska too. Marcia told George she was unsure, but she followed her heart and took the job to be with him. Fortunately, when she finished her work on The Rain People, she was able to work as an assistant editor on Medium Cool after all, and she got the credit she had so badly wanted. George Walton Lucas Jr. and Marcia Lou Griffin were married on February 22, 1969, in a town just south of Monterey, California. Shortly after their honeymoon in Big Sur, they left Hollywood behind and rented a hilltop house in Mill Valley for only $120 a month. But job opportunities for Marcia were pretty much non-existent. All of her friends and family were in Southern California, so she was homesick. With no job opportunities on the horizon, Marcia told George she was ready to have a baby. George wasn't having it. In his mind, they had just gotten married, neither one of them had a stable income, and he didn't want to feel pressure to take a job he hated because he had to support a growing family. Plus, he was frustrated with his career. So they agreed to postpone the baby thing, and Marcia encouraged George to help Francis Ford Coppola set up his film studio, American Zoetrope. That would prove to be a financially and emotionally draining experience. George Lucas may not have agreed with how Coppola did business, but he was able to make his first feature film, THX 1138, because of him.
All Earth Council, in its infinite wisdom, has decided these two numbers are to be disposed of. The Biochemical Forum has demands to make on their parts, however, before they are eliminated.
George and Marcia edited the film together for a year in their Mill Valley house. THX 1138 was a science fiction film, a political film, and a personal film for George, primarily because it had been developed from his USC student film, Electronic Labyrinth, THX 1138 4EB. It may now be a cult classic among Star Wars fans, but in 1971, it was a commercial failure. American Zoetrope was basically falling apart and sinking deeper into debt. At one point during this time, George and Marcia's savings had dwindled to practically nothing. But George was sure his new film idea, American Graffiti, would be a mainstream hit. Filming and post-production on American Graffiti was an incredibly stressful time for George and Marcia. George wanted Marcia to edit the film, but the studio wanted someone with more experience. George hired Verna Fields, who in his mind could act like a buffer between him and the studio. Verna worked on the film for 10 weeks, just long enough to do a rough cut, and then passed the film on to Marcia and George to finish. They edited the film in Francis Ford Coppola's garage, and in the end, American Graffiti has become one of the most profitable films of all time.
This may all be happening right now.
In 1973, while George was busy writing his first draft of Star Wars, Marcia's career was taking off. She had been the assistant editor on Michael Ritchie's film The Candidate, starring a young Robert Redford. And in part because of her work on American Graffiti and a recommendation by Michael Ritchie, Martin Scorsese hired Marcia to edit his film Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. The film was released in 1975 and starred Ellen Bernstein as a recently widowed and aspiring singer named Alice, who, through a series of events, ends up getting a job as a waitress in a diner. Ellen Bernstein won an Oscar for her role as Alice, and the film would serve as the springboard for the popular TV sitcom Alice. While Marcia was editing the film on location in Arizona, George decided to join her. He holed up in the hotel room to continue writing Star Wars. As George continued writing, Marcia continued working. She loved the work she was doing, and she had developed a good relationship with Martin Scorsese. Marty trusted her and her ability, so he hired Marcia as a supervising film editor on his next picture, Taxi Driver.
You talking to me? Then who the hell else are you talking? You talking to me?
Taxi Driver went on to get nominated for 4 Academy Awards and solidified the careers of both Robert De Niro and Jodie Foster. The critical acclaim both Scorsese's films received gave Marcia's confidence a boost. She was proving herself to be a great film editor, and she was proud to be a part of these important films Scorsese was making. She also knew that the only way she'd be taken seriously as an editor was if she expanded her filmography beyond her husband George. She once said, quote, "If I'm ever going to get any real credit, I'm going to have to cut a movie for somebody else besides George, because if I'm cutting for my husband, they're going to think George lets his wife play around in the cutting room," end quote. George Lucas relied on his friends and Marcia as he wrote Star Wars. He bounced ideas off of them, took their notes and rewrote sequences, and would tape record their comments and criticism. Some of his friends urged George to give up on this crazy idea with Luke Starkiller and the robots. Marcia didn't get it, but she was George's biggest supporter throughout the Star Wars process. She offered criticism if she didn't understand something, but as she said, quote, "I'm real hard, but I only tell him what he already knows," end quote. Because she spoke the truth, George trusted her ideas and opinions. Marcia was the only person he felt comfortable venting his frustrations to. Part of that frustration came from the editor he had hired while on location in England. After George saw editor John Jimson's rough cut of the film, he felt the film was boring and lacked the energy and adventure that the creator had originally envisioned. George fired Jimson, and once George was back in California, Marcia started back at square one with the film. As he and Marcia started going through the footage, George became depressed. This was not the movie he had envisioned for the past 7 years. Now, if you've seen the raw footage of A New Hope without the visual effects, sound effects, and music, particularly the lightsaber duel between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader, it is a bit lackluster.
Action.
How is the recall man?
George knew that how they edited this film was going to determine whether or not audiences would fall in love with Star Wars. Here's George Lucas sharing why editing is so important for a film's success.
Everybody says, well, the script doesn't work, but we'll fix it later. They say, well, we're shooting this, but it isn't really working, but we'll fix it in the editing. Well, the editing is where it's got to be fixed. If it doesn't work there, the movie doesn't work.
Editing Star Wars was overwhelming. There was no way Marcia could tackle this alone, so George hired a second editor, Richard Chew. When it was clear the workload was still too much, he hired a third editor, Paul Hirsch, who had just finished editing Brian De Palma's film Carrie. The three editors became a team, spending weeks standing at their moviolas, cataloging hours of footage while George bounced from editor to editor, telling each one what he wanted done. The thing about editing is that it's laborious. A movie can have up to 200 scenes, and for each scene, there are several camera angles. There may be a master shot, a medium shot, close-ups of each actor, over-the-shoulder shots, a high-angle shot. Sometimes the director will dolly around an actor. Not to mention the slight variations in a performance that an actor will give for each take. And some directors, like Stanley Kubrick, like to film up to 100 takes of an actor. So an editor has to make a lot of decisions to take all of these pieces and tell a story. Sometimes directors can get caught up on details like interesting camera angles, but as an editor, Marcia was very gifted at structuring movies because she always focused on the story and the characters. There are two major scenes in Star Wars that Marcia directly influenced. The first is the scene between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader. Here is a copy of Peter Mayhew's original Star Wars script that he shared back in 2016. Originally, Obi-Wan and Vader have their lightsaber battle. Then Kenobi hits a door and the door slams closed and they all run away and Vader is left standing there with egg on his face. This was supposed to be a climactic scene, but with Kenobi escaping, there was no climax. So halfway during filming, George began to rewrite the scene, but he was stuck. Marcia thought about it and came up with a fix.
I said to George, I think I've got some ideas that somebody needs to get injured or hurt. And he said, well, and he didn't like any of that. And I said, but what if Obi-Wan Kenobi lets Darth Vader strike him down? And George said, I kind of like that. And I said, well, in the end of the film, when he's telling Luke to use the Force, to trust him, that can be Luke remembering what he was taught, or it can be, it can be him talking to him from another dimension. And it sort of added a kind of an interesting, spiritual, strange kind of film, and it gave the second act a real climax, because no one expects that we're going to lose Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Jedi Master. Anyway, I killed him.
The second scene Marcia shaped is the final Death Star trench run at the end of A New Hope. George told Rolling Stone magazine in 1977, quote, I think it took her 8 weeks to cut that battle. It was extremely complex and we had 40,000 feet of dialogue footage of pilots saying this and that, and she had to cull through all that and pull in all the fighting as well. Nobody really has ever tried to interweave an actual plot story into a dogfight. We were trying to do that, however successful or unsuccessful we were, end quote. Here's the legendary Ben Burtt talking about how creative this editing method was.
They were employing a process I'd never seen before, which we now call videomatics. That is, you create temporary shots that are really cheap, but they tell the story about how fast the ship moves, or an airplane's going to bank left, or you got a shot coming at you or away from you. And a whole collection had been made of newsreel and old Air Force footage, combat footage, which would be what Marcia would have to cut in to structure the flying action in the sequence. And you wanted to make sure that you worked out all the angles and how many frames there were going to be, because once you go to ILM and they generate the real shot, that's expensive. They can't produce dailies in the same sense with many takes and you choose.
The Death Star trench run scene was absolutely crucial to the success of the film. If each shot was arranged and strung together just right, it would make you sit on the edge of your seat. Here's Marcia talking about the importance of that scene.
If the audience doesn't react when Han Solo flies in the Millennium Falcon this movie's not going to work.
Thankfully for all of us, that battle worked, and it is in large part because of Marcia's skillful editing. In January of 1977, the team finally had assembled a rough cut of Star Wars. Martin Scorsese, meanwhile, was begging Marcia to come to LA to edit his latest picture, New York, New York, starring Robert De Niro. Marty's editor had died, unfortunately, and he needed Marcia to finish his film. She needed a break from Star Wars, so she took the job and flew to LA to work on the film. Richard Chew and Paul Hirsch finished editing Star Wars, and Marcia would assist wherever she could. Obviously, you can say it all came together in the end. George didn't want to go to the 1978 Academy Awards, but he wanted to support Marcia, who had been nominated and won an Academy Award for Best Film Editing on Star Wars.
The winners are Paul Hirsch, Marcia Lucas, and Richard Chew for Star Wars.
I'd like to express my admiration for my colleagues, Marcia and Richard, who are not only great editors, they're great people. We had a director who, apart from his many other obvious talents, is himself a fine editor, George Lucas. Thank you, George. Thank you.
This was an incredible moment for Marcia. The award represented how much she had struggled to establish herself in the profession and how proud she was to have her hard work recognized. It should also be noted that in 1978, before Marcia, only 6 other women had won an Academy Award for editing, including Verna Fields for Jaws in 1976. To date, that total has gone up to 13. Marcia's contributions to Star Wars continued on Empire Strikes Back, which she helped edit, although she is uncredited, and also Return of the Jedi, which she co-edited. Here's fellow editor Duwayne Dunham sharing what Marcia's superpower is as an editor.
But if there was anything that was dramatic or emotional, George gave it to Marcia. And Marcia was the last, and George always said, he said, always keep one person whose opinion you trust to the very end. And that was always Marcia.
The thing about Marcia is that she always speaks her mind. There's a great story about her watching a screening of Raiders of the Lost Ark. I'll let her tell it.
We had that screening of Indiana Jones, and it was such an amazing movie, and it was so great. And in the script, there was this scene with Marion and Indy coming out of the building, you know, and going to get a drink, whatever, walking off. And it wasn't in the movie. I said, what happened to that scene? Steven stood up and George stood up. Remember, he said, we didn't need it. We didn't film it. I said, excuse me. I think you could use that scene. I don't think you should leave Marion tied to the stick in the cave after the ark explodes. I said, you're not giving that little love story enough credit, you know. They were together in the film and they had a relationship. You know, we need to know that Marion's okay. And they were, she could be right. So then George got the actors and went to San Francisco and shot the scene in front of the San Francisco City Hall of them coming. It was scripted, but they hadn't shot it. They didn't need it. Well, I thought they needed it.
Between 1978 and 1981, Marcia put her career on hold to be a wife and eventually a mother of their adopted daughter, Amanda. In 1981, George said, I don't really know if she'll go back to editing, and she's a good editor. Usually the offers are to go to New York or go to Los Angeles, and that's no fun for us. It's like 6 months apart and coming home at weekends maybe. But once we get our facility up here, if a director wants her to edit, it will be much easier to convince him to do it up here rather than wherever he lives. The whole reason for the ranch, actually, is just a giant facility to allow my wife to cut film in Marin County. Unfortunately, that plan never happened, and in 1983, George and Marcia filed for divorce. There were rumors and speculation, but the way Marcia tells it, it was simply their differences that eventually drove them apart. In more recent years, Marcia has been vocal about her thoughts on the prequels and sequels. She didn't like them, but that's not surprising since she also wasn't thrilled when the digital age took over cinema. She's old school, she's analog, and the industry's transition to digital is probably one of the reasons she never edited a film after Return of the Jedi. In 1984, a year after they were divorced, George, Marcia, and Steven Spielberg came together to dedicate USC's new cinema television facility. They all have school buildings with their names on it, but there is something particularly neat about walking onto campus and seeing the Marcia Lucas Post-Production Center. The center has visual effects studios, sound mixing rooms, and of course, editing bays for students. In fact, Marcia has continued to be involved in USC's School of Cinematic Arts over the years, donating millions of dollars in grants to finance programs for USC students. Marcia Lucas helped shape some of the most memorable scenes in cinema history. However, Marcia doesn't want people to give her all the credit. Quote, "I definitely made scenes work. I made the end battle work, but I wasn't the writer and I wasn't the director, and I didn't come up with the creative names, Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker. All those names are classics. George came up with all of it, using his amazing imagination," end quote. Still, Marcia Lucas's contributions to Star Wars are invaluable. On every project throughout her career, she brought out the heart and emotion of the story. And that is the Marcia Lucas effect.
Great shot, kid. That was 1 in a million.
Remember, the Force will be with you, always.
I'm glad that Marcia has reemerged and is giving interviews. She's still got it. She's funny, she's engaging, she's inspiring, and she has a lot of valuable insight to share on filmmaking. I don't know if Marcia will ever see this video, but leave a comment. Let her know the impact that her work has had on your life. If you like this type of content on ForceCenter, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more Jedi Beat episodes. Thanks so much for joining me. May the Force be with you, and I'll see you next time.